All right. Here we are. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Preterist Apologetics with Mike Sullivan over here and myself, Don K. Preston. We're very, very glad that you're with us. And by the way, I want to thank you again for everyone for all the really, really kind remarks that we continue to get. Mike, I had somebody else just this week say, man, I've come to rely on the Odd Couple for for my viewing. He said, I can't do without this. You guys keep this up. You can't ever stop.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I got a bang out of it, and people really seem to be enjoying it and benefiting from it. That's obviously why we're doing it, to equip the saints out there, for people to be able to respond to the critics, and there are plenty of them out there. And so hopefully what we are providing here, ladies and gentlemen, is some help. You know, um, I've been at this an awful long time. Mike's been at it not near as long as I have, but a good little while. And so we do bring a lot of experience to the table. We're certainly not the only ones out there that have great experience, great knowledge, and great understanding. But we're happy to be able to be with you and to share our understanding of Scripture. And what we began doing last week, and we urged everyone to take some time to read the entirety of Psalms 110, because not only Doug Wilson, but Kenneth Gentry, Sam Frost, and all of the signers of the letter that was recently published against Gary DeMar, they believe that Psalms 110 is really, to use the Latin term, a crux interpretum. It is a key critical text to prove a yet future coming of the Lord. And the reason they do that is because they say, well, okay, this is referring to the time in which Jesus ascended to the Father. He sat down at the right hand there, and from there he would rule in the midst of his enemies until his enemies are made his footstool. Well, just look around. His enemies haven't been made his footstool. Therefore, we're waiting for the time, according to Doug Wilson, in which material creation is recreated and every sin, every bad thing that is in the world is abolished, completely done away with. And that we have, therefore, in this literal, physical new heaven and new earth, a utopian society, a utopian world. And of course, we've already gone over some things to show that that does not work. So with that in mind, as I said, we asked everyone that was with us last week to read Psalms 110, the entirety of it. Mike, why don't you give us a real quick overview of Psalms 110 and your initial thoughts on it?
Sure. I actually have about 7 brief points on it. And the first thing I want to show is that there's a translation issue that we really, really need to look at, not only in Psalm 110, but in Hebrews 5, 6, and 7. Okay. And I'm going to highly recommend this book, Jesus, the Incarnation of the Word, by David Mitchell. He also has a great book that I used in my book, Messiah ben Joseph. I mean, this guy's awesome. He's a Hebrew scholar. Dr. Michael Heiser, who's a Hebrew scholar as well, totally endorses this guy. He's had him on his podcast. So let's address this, because who is Melchizedek? who is this Lord of David? Is he just some nameless guy? Or is Psalm 110 itself telling you who David's Lord is? All right. So Yahweh, God, vows to that is David, Lord, that's Messiah, or I'm going to argue Melchizedek. Sit at my right hand till I set your enemies to be a footstool for your feet. Yahweh will send forth your mighty scepter from Zion, rule amidst your enemies. With you is dominion on the day of your strength. Amidst the shining lights of the holy ones, I have begotten you from the womb before the morning star. Yahweh has sworn and will not disavow. You are a Kohen, that is a priest, forever, according to my decree, O Melchizedek. And now that's much different than according to the order of Melchizedek. So what we're arguing for and what Mitchell argues for here is that this is not a nameless individual. He's referring to Melchizedek as the Messiah, as this eternal one. All right. And he's also saying that there are not two competing eternal priests. One Melchizedek, who may be a type of Jesus, because they're a priest forever. So that would have two priests in conflict. And so I like this. And then, of course, let's talk about the rest of the psalm here. The Lord at your right hand crushes kings in the day of his wrath. I don't know, Don, I think Hebrews has a lot to say about, Revelation has a lot to say about the day of his wrath. He executes judgment among the nations, fullness of corpses. He crushes the head or ruler of the wide earth. From my brook by the road will he drink, so will he lift up his head. So I just wanted to point out that there's a translation issue here that makes it really clear that Messiah is referred to as Melchizedek. And I will go through some points, and I will get into 11Q Melchizedek and how the Jews of the first century understood Psalm 110 in connection with other passages, and that this interpretation was very, very common. In Genesis 12, God tells Abraham to go to another land, and God is going to bless him there. When Abraham gets to the land in Genesis 14:19, who blesses him? Melchizedek. After the meeting with Melchizedek and being blessed by him in chapter 14, in chapter 15, Abraham has a vision. Now remember, in John 12, when Jesus tells the Jews that Isaiah had a vision of God on his temple, he says, he saw me. So oftentimes when prophets are having visions of God, they're looking at the pre-incarnate bodily form of Jesus. All right. So he's having a vision. Abraham's having a vision that God took him out. So it's a vision of God taking him outside to look at the stars, where he promises Abraham that he will be his shield, reward, make him his offspring as much as the stars, and he will make a covenant with him. But he doesn't bless him here. Genesis 18, God comes once again to Abraham in a human form. Verse 1, verse 13, verse 22. He eats with him and promises he will have a son within a year. Asks him advice on Sodom, but again, does not bless him. Look what takes place, though, in Genesis 22. Decades later, in Genesis 22, God tells Abraham to sacrifice his only son in the land of Moriah on a mountain that he's going to tell him to go to. Many years later, Mount Moriah became the Temple Mount in Second Chronicles 3:1. So the land of Moriah was the territory of Jerusalem, or Shalem, Melchizedek's city, the very one who first blessed Abraham. In Melchizedek's city, it is the angel of the Lord who tells Abraham not to sacrifice his son, and it is he who blesses Abraham once again. And throughout the Bible, this angel of the Lord is the visible God. He's the second power of the Godhead. He's visibly God on earth. We can call this a Christology. We can talk a theonomy, or Christology. What is the other term?
It's theophany.
Theophany, there you go. Philo of Alexandria took the term from word in Hebrew, davar, who appeared to Abraham and Samuel. And he goes to Genesis 15 and 1 Samuel 3:21. And Philo says this word, or logos, davar, is the angel of Yahweh and of God. They are one and the same. Philo also refers to Messiah, or the word, or the logos, as the high priest and king. Now, I'm kind of developing as we get into Hebrews 5-7 real quick. And I love this, and I spent a lot of time on this in my book. In 11Q Melchizedek, that's from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we learn that first century Jews believed Messiah was Melchizedek, and they conflated Psalm 110, which is what we're looking at, with Daniel 7:13, Psalm 82, Isaiah 52, which Don has spent a lot of time on, and Isaiah 61. They conflated them together. Now, what were they expecting? They were looking at all these texts to teach that Melchizedek was Messiah. They used the terms interchangeably in this passage. He would come after 9 Jubilees, that's a quote, of Daniel 9, 24 and 27. And in the 10th Jubilee, he would reveal himself to Israel, proclaiming salvation, and his high priestly work of atonement would be accomplished for the sons of light. He would be cut off, and like Psalm 110, he would come as a warrior king, judging the wicked, Satan, and the fallen sons of God of Psalm 82, and establish his kingdom. This would all be accomplished within that 10th Jubilee, a 49 to 50 year period. The Jews calculated the 10 Jubilees of Daniel 9. They varied because they didn't know what year to start, and they didn't know if they should do it by every 49th year or 50th year. Okay. But the bottom line is they believed Messiah was supposed to show up, according to all these Old Testament passages, between AD 17 and AD 28. Of course, we know when Jesus shows up to announce the time of Jubilee has been fulfilled. Jesus and the New Testament authors both identify him as Melchizedek, Jesus as Melchizedek, and that he would accomplish all of the soteriological and eschatological events I just referenced in 11Q Melchizedek within the first century. So Jesus and the New Testament authors are tracking on 11Q Melchizedek. Jesus is Melchizedek. He's Messiah. He's eternal. And he is going to accomplish all of this within his generation. Just a couple more points. Everyone knew Jesus was identifying himself as Messiah, but the question as to who the Messiah was in the first century was hotly debated. The Pharisees looked at texts such as Psalm 110, which we're looking at, and Daniel 7:13, the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and were divided on if Messiah was going to be more than just a man or perhaps somehow divine. Many of the common people, especially the Nazarenes, upheld the view that Messiah was divine in origin and nature. This is why Jesus, in discussing Psalm 110 in Matthew 22 with the Pharisees, made it clear the passage speaks of a divine eternal being and not a mere man, which it says silenced them. And in John 10, where Jesus makes one of his strongest cases for being God and one with the Father, he reminds the Jews that he is the divine Messiah, chief Son of God, and thus one with the Father of the council of Psalms 82 that was in charge of judging the sons of God. Peter sees this judgment day of these fallen watchers in chains, in darkness, catch the power of this, as not being delayed. 2 Peter 2:3. Now, Don, this is interesting because Doug takes the same position I do of Genesis 6, 2 Peter 3, Jude 6, when they're quoting First Enoch. He takes this as the judgment of the watchers. Now, in a recent video attacking us, he started the video by quoting the Westminster Confession of Faith, saying that the judgment of the living and the dead is future, and he was upholding the creed. And yet 1 Peter 4, 5-7, and verse 7 says that the appointed time of the judgment was ready and at hand. And Peter goes on to say, not only that, but he's going to judge those watchers or those fallen angels that are in chains. And he says, it's not going to be delayed. It's not asleep. Okay. And then one last point. Jesus identifies himself as being divine and most likely Melchizedek in John 8, where he states emphatically, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw and was glad. And then they argue, they get what he said. Mm-hmm. And they say, hey, you're not even 50 years old. How can you say you were in Abraham's day? Well, I used to look at this before I read these books, that Jesus was saying, well, Abraham, he anticipated me coming someday, and he rejoiced. He believed that the Messiah was going to come. But no, I think he's talking about, I was with Melchizedek. He honored me. He gave me a tithe. He sat down and gave me a meal. We fellowshipped. He honored and respected me. You Jews are saying he's your father? You don't honor me like he did. I was with him. He saw me. He rejoiced. So I think, some people could say, well, he's talking about the angel of the Lord. He saw the angel of the Lord. Well, again, angel of the Lord and Melchizedek, the Jews are conflating with Messiah. These are one entity. So I think that's awesome. And then the last thing here, and I'll let you jump in. These are some translation issues in Hebrews that Mitchell goes over. Basically the same as Psalm 110. He says, in Hebrews 5:6, he, that is God, says to Christ in another place, you are a priest forever according to my, or the decree, O Melchizedek, not according to an order of Melchizedek. 6:20, where the forerunner has entered for us, Jesus, according to the decree, O Melchizedek, become a high priest forever. For whatever need was there for another priest to arise according to the decree, O Melchizedek, and not to be named according to the decree of Aaron. Hebrews 7:11, and the last one, Hebrews 7:17. For it is declared of Christ, you are a priest forever according to my decree, O Melchizedek. Now that brings a whole different enchilada and meaning to this. As we're building the case in Hebrews chapter 10 from verse 12 to verse 37, when he cites Psalm 110, he's already built his case that Jesus is Melchizedek and he is Messiah and he is coming for the judgment that was declared in Psalm 110. And he says it's about to take place. I'm going to burn up my enemies. And I'll kind of leave it at that. But
that was a mouthful.
It was. For those critics that say I don't talk too much, there we go.
Now, folks, if you didn't catch his reference, everything that he's given us here, in a nutshell, he expounds on even more in his book, The Armageddon Deception. I want to tell you, I've said this before on different venues. If you haven't gotten a copy of Mike's book, the amount of research in this, and it covers a wide range of material, all the way from study of Islamic eschatology, which in our day and time is really, really important, to Jewish eschatology and the Jewish background. Of course, that's a whole lot of that is what I particularly appreciate. I haven't even finished the section on Islamic eschatology, Mike, but the sections on the Jewish background and what you just shared with us, from the beliefs of the Dead Sea Scroll, who's generally believed to be the Essenes. Pardon me. And this whole issue of Melchizedek, I have said for many, many years that the subject of Melchizedek is one of those subjects that has a world of thought associated with it that we moderns have never even begun to tap into.
Yeah, I agree.
We've never even touched it. And I do not claim by any stretch of the imagination to be an expert on Melchizedek. And a lot of the things that you said there are just absolutely more than intriguing, more than enlightening. And one of the things that our viewers may not be aware of, people talk about the Jews saying the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God." I say, well, okay, then Jesus could not be God. He could not be divine. That is a failure to understand. There was a long standing tradition, and Mike discusses it in his book, about the two powers of heaven. I have a book in my library entitled The Two Powers of Heaven. And it covers this over this wide range of scholarly literature, Hebraic citations of where the Jews had no problem whatsoever in saying there were two Jehovahs, two Yahwehs. Now, they might take a greater and a lesser, but they still recognize them of the same essential essence. And that's
Yeah.
the important thing.
And the Messiah, the Son or the Logos, was from everlasting. He had
Absolutely.
no origin. So even if he's viewed as a lesser, I mean, if if there was no beginning to him, that's why Jesus could say, "I'm one with the Father." Abraham saw me as Melchizedek and the angel of the Lord, and then right after that, I am. I'm the great I am. Before Abraham,
Exactly.
I
Uh,
am. They
it's
all.
it's incredible stuff. Now, I do want to, for our purposes in examining Doug Wilson and his failure to connect the dots on so much of this stuff, I want to go back to something you mentioned there that you cover in your book very well, and that I've seen discussed in Margaret Barker's book. Margaret Barker is recognized as one of the world's greatest authorities on the Jewish temple, Jewish feast days, even. And some of the things that she makes segues beautifully into what you say in your book, and that is the Jews had a very firm expectation that in the 50th Jubilee, now you
The
got to go
10th,
back,
the
got
10th.
to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 15 and the mandate about the Jubilees. Every 50th year, what's supposed to happen? Well, everyone who owed debts, the debt's supposed to be abolished. Anyone in prison, supposed to be released. It was theoretically and theologically, it was to be a world transforming for the Jews and for the people of Israel, an absolute transformative time, a time of joy, a time of release. Well, again, as Mike pointed out there a few moments ago, they knew it, or they believed very strongly. They tied this with Daniel chapter 9 without any question whatsoever. So they tied all of this expectation, this messianic expectation of Melchizedek coming. And by the way, they tied it with the time of Elijah, which is incredible. And if I may point this out, just today, I've had this very brief exchange with Sam Frost on one of his posts about, oh well, all these preterists, look at what they say, um, you know sin's not going to end, and this and that and the other, and we're looking for the restoration and this and that and the other. So I posed the question, and of course he's laughing and scoffing at those of us who and what have you. But I asked Sam a question. Well, Jesus said that John was Elijah, and Elijah would come and to restore. He uses the Greek word apokathistonai. It's used in Acts chapter 1. It's used in Matthew chapter 17 about the role of John as Elijah. So what was Elijah supposed to do? He was supposed to restore all things. That apokathistonai is just a different cognate of apokatastasis in Acts chapter 3, where Peter said, whom the heavens must withhold, and they're speaking of Jesus, obviously, until the time of the restoration of all things. So Christ would come at the climax, at the consummation of the restoration of all things, the restoration spoken of and initiated by John. Now, this raises all sorts of serious questions for Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson says and believes the restoration of all things is the restoration of material creation. As I like to say, bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. Well, guess what? John was supposed to be in that. So I pointed out to Sam, John's role was to begin the restoration of all things. Again, just a different cognate from apokatastasis used in Acts chapter 3. So my question to Sam was, did John the Baptizer fail in his mission to begin the restoration of all things? So Sam responded, well, I certainly believe John came. Well, excuse me, Sam, that's not the question.
Right.
It's not the question that was posed. It's pure diversion. It's smoke. It's dust. It's obfuscation. But that's what Sam Frost does these days. He doesn't answer direct questions on what the text actually say. He dances and he dodges and obfuscates and, like I said, throws up dust and smoke. But again, folks, this gets back to the role. It's the role of Elijah, and it's the role of Melchizedek to be the priest and to make atonement, which of course was the role of Jesus. So all of this ties into, Doug's attack on full preterist. He's not considering these different roles in the light of, guess what? Jubilee. When was it expected? Well, let's see. Luke chapter 4.
Yes.
Jesus is standing in the synagogue of Capernaum and takes the scroll, stands up to read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach glad tidings of good things. And just quotes or reads from Isaiah chapter 61. And part of that was to declare the acceptable year of the Lord, which is a jubilee. And Margaret Barker goes into good detail and says Jesus was announcing, and some good chronographers have said the chronology works out. The 50th Jubilee had begun. And Jesus said, this day has this been fulfilled in your sight. That is Jesus saying, guys, 50th Jubilee. Now, what this means for Doug and Kenneth Gentry and all other futurists who are looking for this physical restoration, what was the year of Jubilee? It was time of restoration. The land was to lie fallow so that it could be restored and become fertile once again, as it was every 7 years. And again, prisoners were to be released. Debtors were supposed to be forgiven their debt. Slaves were supposed to be given their freedom. It's the time of the recreation of the land and of the people. It's the great restoration. 50th Jubilee in the time of Jesus. But what does Doug and all of our partial preterist friends do? Oh, they put the 50th Jubilee restoration at the end of time, totally unrelated, by the way, to the fulfillment of Israel's festal calendar. A major fallacy.
Amen. Well, let me piggyback on a couple of those texts. So Acts 2 and 3. Acts 2, we have Psalm 110 quoted by Peter, correct?
Yes.
So we have the already. Well, Peter, when's the not yet of him coming from heaven as a mighty warrior to not only atone for the sins of his people, but bring judgment? Oh, gee, Acts 2 addresses that. 20 verses 20 through 40. The day of the Lord, he tells them, that audience, be saved from the day of the Lord of Joel. And then he goes on and he says, be saved from this perverse and crooked generation of Deuteronomy 32 verses 5 and 20. They were in that last days, last perverse generation of Moses's eschatology. And Peter says, here it is. Now, going back to Acts 3, all right, the restoration, how does he end that?
Yeah.
He ends that by saying, let's see here, that if they didn't heed what he was saying, that Christ would come from heaven and they would be destroyed from the people, from among the people, which is a quote from, I think, Deuteronomy, another
Deuteronomy 18.
Deuteronomy 18. So this is a covenantal curse. Again, we're identifying the enemies here as primarily the Jewish enemies that said, we will not have this man reign over us. He's ascended. He comes back with the kingdom, and he has those enemies slain before him. Hebrews is tracking on that. Acts 2 and 3 is tracking on that. And then you bring up Luke 4, quoting Isaiah 61. Now, there's an already and a not yet to that Jubilee promise. He quotes the already. And let's just talk about the already before we talk about the day of vengeance, the not yet in Isaiah 61. the already there is beautiful because, as William Bell, I think, did a really good job in his debate with Sam, pointing out how, and there's a lot of scholars that see this. They see it in the Gospel of John. They also see it in the book of Revelation, which John writes as well, where they're seeing the feast days just everywhere.
Everywhere.
But where interesting in the Gospel of John, every feast, Jesus stands up and he says he's the fulfillment of, whether it's the ceremony of lights where they would light up Jerusalem, literally all night long. It just looked like it was day all throughout Jerusalem because of the lights. And he says, I'm the light of the world. Or the festival where they would go and get water from what brook was that, or river of David? I forget. But they would get with the golden bowl and they would
they would go down to the pool of Siloam.
Yes,
and where it was called the water drawing ceremony.
Yes, and on the last day of that ceremony, Jesus stands up and says, I am the living water. So we have a pattern here, Don, of Jesus using every feast or every day that's connected with their calendar, and he says, I'm the fulfillment of. And I did the math from, and you got to remember, the Jews used their calendar, not the Gentile calendar, and that was off by about 160 years, one. And number two, they didn't start the count with the decree of Cyrus. They see that as the prophetic word of Jeremiah. So they incorporate the 70 years going back to starting with Jeremiah's prophecy and the destruction of the temple from the Babylonians. That's where they start the count. Now, if you start that at 420 BC to AD 70, what do you have? You have 490 years, okay? That's why they were looking for Messiah right when Jesus came. But not only that, but you have the eschatological, well, so I think that was right at the beginning of that 10th Jubilee. If you do the math, Margaret Barker has some figures. I have some figures where I see the 10th Jubilee starting between 26 and 28, which is the beginning of Jesus's ministry when he opens up the scroll of Isaiah 61, which they connected to Daniel 9:24 to 27. So he's the fulfillment of all the feast days, and he is the fulfillment of the 10th Jubilee. He is that long-awaited Messiah that was going to, and 11Q Melchizedek, it does apply that spiritually. This is an atonement for sins, it says, of Israel. They're not taking it as, some hyper literal concept. So that's another kind of key thing to that. But now the eschatological not yet of Isaiah 61, it talks about a day of vengeance. All right. And what does Jesus talk about? The days of vengeance in Luke 21. That's his day of wrath. And it's not 2,000 years away or 2,000 plus years away. It was still within that 10th Jubilee period. And in his second Exodus generation, all these things come together in that last generation.
Absolutely. And there's that key term there in Psalms 110, in the day of his wrath, verse 5. And this term is used throughout the Tanakh. I mean, it's everywhere. It's Zephaniah, it's Amos, it's Hosea, it's Isaiah, it's Jeremiah. Over and over and over, this term. Now, it's used of different periods of time, okay? But it is invariably a historical judgment that God was bringing. By the way, in my newest book that I just published, these are the days in which all things are fulfilled. I have an extensive study of the days of vengeance and the days of wrath. Those terms, as they are used throughout the Old Testament, and how Jesus here in incorporating Isaiah chapter 61 into his message. Now, I should point out, our dispensational friends say, oh, well, look, he only said that it was his duty to declare the acceptable year of the Lord. He purposely left out, and the day of vengeance of our God. So therefore, it wasn't his mission to declare it. Well, I wonder why he said, speaking of the fall of Jerusalem, and all dispensationalists agree that in Luke 21, 20 through 24, he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he said, these be the days of vengeance, in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. So, the dispensationalists say, oh, well, Jesus didn't come to talk about the days of vengeance. And yet, Luke 19, he talks about the days of vengeance. And other passages, certainly Luke chapter 21 talks about the day of wrath. Revelation chapter 6, John was talking about the great day of wrath of the Lord God Almighty. Revelation 16, on and on it goes. The New Testament references pick up the terminology of, the motif and theme of the day of wrath, and invariably put it in that imminent context. But guess what they do? Back to the day of Jubilee. At the time of the great day of God's wrath, what comes from it? Oh, the new creation. And that's the very point that we're trying to share with our audience, to help everyone see that on the one hand, Doug sees that 2 Peter chapter 3 was fulfilled in AD 70 in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's a new creation. He goes to Revelation chapter 21, and he says, well, this is not talking about a material new creation. It's the new covenant creation. And Kenneth Gentry, in his little book, small book, Navigating the Book of Revelation, says, Revelation chapter 21 is not, as is commonly supposed, a picture of the end of material creation. It's the depiction of the marriage of the new covenant bride, because the old covenant bride has been divorced and displaced, and the new covenant bride replaces her. Oh, guess what? That happened in AD 70, ladies and gentlemen. And if anyone wants the page numbers from Kenneth's book, and again, the name of the book is Navigating the Book of Revelation, then I'll be glad, just contact me. I'll be glad to give you the actual page number. But anyway, I wanted to let everyone know that this concept of the day of wrath, I covered extensively in my brand new book, and I've got a big special going on this month, Seal It Vision Prophecy, and these are the days of vengeance in which all things must be fulfilled. Yeah, you're going to save 10 or 12 bucks with the special I'm offering. Just go to my website, donkpreston.com. So what we're emphasizing here, ladies and gentlemen, is that Doug Wilson has a divorce going on. On the one hand, he sees the day of wrath of 2 Peter chapter 3. He sees the day of wrath of Revelation 16, Revelation 6. He sees the day of wrath of Revelation chapter 18 and 19, AD 70. Well, what comes after that day of wrath that Doug Wilson posits at AD 70? The marriage, the end of the millennium, the new creation, the new Jerusalem. And yet, even though he admits and agrees with that, in some of these key, absolutely crucial eschatological texts, he comes to Romans chapter 8, for instance, and completely, totally jumps ship, as if it's a totally separate, independent prophecy, unrelated to all of these other passages that are dealing with the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises to Israel, found in, typified in her feast days, and especially, since we mentioned it, the 50th Jubilee, which Jesus declared, the time has come. You cannot separate the ultimate fulfillment of that final Jubilee. And I would make one other point here, and it's not a separate point. Segues beautifully. And I don't remember if you touch on this in the book or not, Mike, but the Jews not only believe that there will only be 50 Jubilees, they also believe that there would only be 10 red heifer sacrifices.
Well, they understood there would be 10 Jubilees from the count of the destruction of the temple under the Babylonians.
Correct.
To the second temple being destroyed. They understood there would be 10 Jubilees. And
that's correct.
That's what it comes to. Yeah.
Yeah. But they also believe very firmly that there would only be a totality of 10 red heifer sacrifices until the Messiah. Well, Josephus, it is, who tells us, I think it's Josephus, I chronicled this in one of my books. There had been 9 red heifer sacrifices until the day of the 1st century. And
wow, I would really like that. You got to send that to me.
Okay. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Oh, it's super cool. So what does Hebrews chapter 9 tell us? Well, Hebrews chapter 9, if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a red heifer, sanctifies to the purifying of the flesh, then how much more shall the blood of Jesus Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot and without blemish, hey, that's red heifer concept, red heifer terminology, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So here's the writer of Hebrews, who is intimately familiar with the temple, the priesthood cultus. He is directly referring to the red heifer, and he's saying, guess what? Jesus is it. And somebody says, well, Jesus wasn't a female, it wasn't a heifer. It's not the point. He's using that typology. He's using that type, antitype, and application, pointing it directly to Jesus. The application is unmistakable. So you have 50 Jubilees bringing us to the first century, which means that the consummation, as we've already said, is the new creation, and which means it's resurrection. You can't separate new creation from resurrection, folks. Sorry, you just can't do it. That creates that creates a horrific dichotomy in biblical eschatology. So you have the 50 Jubilees. Jesus said, it's here. I'm the fulfillment of it. And you have the countdown of 10 red heifers. 9 had been present. The 10th was Jesus. All of this conflates so absolutely beautifully.
Jesus comes in the 10th Jubilee of the Daniel prophecy, and he is the 10th red. That's interesting. That's cool.
It's awesome. It is absolutely awesome. So,
and they offered 70 bulls, right, which is the restoration of the nations
exactly
of
right.
Genesis 10 through 11. And that is cool. I wanted to address real quick 1 Peter 3. He's citing again Psalm 110, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers, having been subjected to him. Now, so that's the already of Psalm 110. Don, the next chapter, as I discussed earlier, tells us what the not yet is. It's the judgment of the living and the dead that was ready. It was the appointed time that was ready to be fulfilled, and it was the judgment. And earlier on, or Second Peter chapter 2, that's when he says that the judgment of these fallen angels that he has subjected them to in the already was not asleep. It was not idle. It would not be delayed. So my point is, guys, everywhere you track Psalm 110, whether it's Acts 2, Peter's eschatology, the already and the not yet is imminent of Psalm 110, him coming as a warrior, him coming as the high priestly king to judge his enemies. Then Peter again cites Psalm 110 in 1 Peter 3. And then the next chapter tells you the not yet of the judgment of those enemies. All right. Then you could go to Revelation, has references to Psalm 110, but the not yet judgment is something imminent.
Let me.
We already talked about Hebrews 10, so I don't know. So when we go to 1 Corinthians 15, Don, is Paul breaking from all of these New Testament references, Jesus in the parables referring to Psalm 110? Highly doubted.
Yeah. Let me pick up and emphasize the very thing you said. Let's go back to Acts chapter 3, shall we? I have long considered, and I've commented on this, I've forgotten, in a couple of my books, I've forgotten which ones. But Peter says, and he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 18, a prophet like unto Moses I will raise up, and it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hear the voice of that prophet shall be utterly cut off. The language here in the Greek, folks, could not be more graphic. Shall be utterly cut off, out from among. That's the literal Greek, out from among. In other words, Peter is saying, you know what, folks, if you don't follow Jesus, you're not following Moses. And what happens if you don't follow Moses? You're not even one of God's people.
He's going to be revealed from heaven and covenantally cut you off if you don't listen to my sermon right now.
That's exactly right.
Generation. So you can't go to Acts 3 and say the restoration is at the end of time, because Peter is not applying it to the end of time.
He drives that home. Yea, Samuel, from Moses, Samuel, and all who have ever written, all the prophets who have ever spoken have spoken of, quote, these days. That's the days. That's the days he's living in. That's the day that you already cited from Acts chapter 2. Save yourself from this untoward generation, not some far off, distant, unknown, generic generation, this generation. So
the generation that would see their end being near.
Exactly right. Now let's go back to 1 Peter chapter 4 that you've hit a couple of licks on, and let's look at it grammatically, linguistically. You've touched on it, but let's just drive it home. As you pointed out, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 22, he has ascended into the heavens. He is seated at the throne. Principalities and powers having been subjected to him. Well, that's Psalms 110. Well, what was he doing while his enemies were being subjected to him? Rule thou in the midst of your enemies. That's the whole point of what Peter's saying. Okay, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5. Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. He uses the Greek word hitoimos, translated as ready. Alfred's Greek Testament says any Greek reader would understand that to be referring to the imminent judge. They just never get the idea, oh, well, it'll happen one of these millennia by and by.
But Don, Sam Frost tells us that it's just always near. Always near, because Christ is omnipresent. Don't you get that?
Oh, yeah. I read it, but now watch verse 7. The end, telos, of all things has drawn near. Perfect tense. Now, I want to point out very, very quickly here, in Luke chapter 21 and verse 8, Jesus, in predicting the time of the end, it's what the apostles ask about, tell us what shall be the sign of your parousia and the end of the age, the suntelia to aionion. And so Jesus is discussing the end. In Luke chapter 21, verse 8, Jesus said, don't let anyone deceive you. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the end has drawn near. Do not go after them. So here very clearly, Jesus is condemning making or even believing premature declarations of the end. Okay?
Doesn't he use kairos too?
Exactly. He does.
Okay.
Yes. In Luke 21, verse 8, he uses kairos, which we're going to get to in a moment. Okay. So here's Peter, who is sitting there on the Mount of Olives, or heard Jesus say, don't believe anyone who says the appointed time has come. Don't believe them. And yet Peter says, 1 Peter 4:17,
appointed time.
The time, the appointed time. It is definite article with kairos. Luke 21:8, the kairos, the divinely appointed time. In this upcoming book, one of these days when it's finally out, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, I have an extensive study of how significant the Greek word kairos is. I mean, I want to tell you what, folks. Throughout the Old Testament, you have the prediction of the coming kairos. And to me, one of the best illustrations of this is Daniel chapter 2, in the days of the Fourth Empire. What? Well, that's the appointed time. The God of heaven shall set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Daniel chapter 7, in the days of the Fourth Empire, the little horn would arise, persecute the saints. Son of Man would come as the Ancient of Days, destroy the little horn. That's the appointed time.
And cause the saints to inherit the kingdom.
Exactly.
Luke 21 is talking about as well.
Daniel chapter 9, 70 weeks are determined. That word determined is katak, and it means cut out. As God, the sovereign God, looked down through the stream of history and the flow of time, he said, okay, from here to here. Within this time frame, within this divinely appointed time frame, the following things are going to be accomplished. Folks, nothing could more powerfully illustrate the meaning of kairos than Daniel. Just as Daniel chapter 12 talks about the appointed time of the end, kairos, the appointed time of the end, kairos eschatu. I mean, here is Daniel that gives us such an incredible insight into the kairos, okay? Brings us right back to Peter. The definite article, kairos, the appointed time for the judgment. And once again, it's definite article in the Greek, judgment, krino.
Don, real quick, I had someone say, "Oh, well, the definite article doesn't mean anything. It's no
Well,
big deal here."
I'm sorry.
What would you say to that?
I'm sorry. Well, Daniel Wallace, who is one of the most highly respected Greek grammarians in the world, literally, in his massive book about that thick, entitled Beyond the Basics of Grammar, of Greek Grammar, said this about the anaphoric article. Now, what in the world is an anaphoric article? Well, an anaphoric article is the, quote, preponderant use of the definite article in the Greek, unquote, according to Daniel Wallace in his book. Okay. The anaphoric article is used like this. A speaker or a writer introduces a subject. Doesn't matter what the subject is. He continues his discussion, and he wants to refer his readers or listeners' thought and minds back to the subject that he introduced earlier. So he uses the definite article. And again, the fancy term for it is anaphoric, anaphoric. And again, Daniel Wallace discusses this extensively. And remember, he says it is the preponderant use of the definite article in the New Testament. So what that means is the huge majority of times in the New Testament, when you have a writer just speaking of a subject, doesn't matter what the subject is, he keeps on talking. And he refers his readers back to that very same subject by using the to refer to it. So what does that mean, ladies and gentlemen? That means that in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5, Peter says that Christ was ready to judge. So he introduces the subject of the judgment. Now, verse 17, he wants to bring the reader's attention back to the subject of the judgment. So he uses to krino, the judgment. In the Greek, that refers them directly back to verse 5. There is no other mention of judgment in the context,
Right.
period. So what does Peter say in 1 Peter chapter 4? The time has come. You can look at every English translation of 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17. They all say the same thing. The time has come. It is the time for the judgment. That means that Peter was not saying in some vague, generic, timeless, oh, well, the judgment's it's always time for the judgment. No. The appointed time for the judgment. Well, what was the appointed time for the judgment? Well, once again, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, in the days of the fourth empire, Daniel chapter 12, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered. And again, he uses kairos. If memory serves me correctly, Daniel chapter 12 uses kairos at least 3 times.
Wow. Is that in the Septuagint, or is that
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. So this is not just a off-the-cuff reference to kairos. Daniel is emphasizing, and let's drive this point home. After talking about the time of the end, the appointed time, the to kairos, in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 4, he tells us in Daniel chapter 12, verse 9 and 10, Daniel, seal up the vision of this book, for it is for many days to come. Hey, Daniel,
you're going to die.
You're going to die. You're going to sleep with your fathers. You're going to rest with your fathers until the time of the end. Oh, yeah, until the time of the end. The kairos eschatu if I'll have to double check, make sure I got the exact phrase. It's interesting. He uses another word, pyros. P-E-I-R-A-S is P-E-I-R-A-S is the way we would spell it in the English. So he uses this time, but he also uses kairos, and he uses eskatu. And I've been trying to memorize that. I've just recently gone through Daniel chapter 12. Well, in the writing of my book, I went through it to drive this home. And man, I got to memorize all this. And so I'm, trying to remember what I was going over. But it's all there. It's in. Let me see. I've got my. See if I can find this just really, really quickly. I have it open to Daniel. Oops. Okay, in Daniel chapter 12. Oh yes, this was an amazing one, by the way. In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4, and you, Daniel, close the words and seal the book to the time of the end, until many are taught and knowledge are increased. Verse 4 uses a really familiar terminology that we find in Matthew 13, Matthew 24. And you, Daniel, seal up the words of this book until Kairu, the appointed time of Suntelius, until the time of the consummation. So it's the appointed time of the consummation.
The end of the age.
Yeah. If that doesn't clue us in, then I don't know what it's going to take to clue us in. Then down in verse 6, one angel asked the other, what shall be the end? Now that's the pyros. Don't ask me why it changes, but what this shows is that the biblical writers, through the Holy Spirit, were not restricted to using one or two words. Like some of our theological friends like to say, well, this text over here uses a different word than this one over here. Kenneth Gentry likes to argue like that very commonly. Keith Matheson argues like that. Well, because, for instance, Kenneth Gentry says that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you be not soon shaken. And Kenneth Gentry says, well, you see, this is AD 70. Wait a minute. We beseech you by the coming of our Lord. That's parousia. That's parousia. Oh, but in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 15 and 17, is parousia. So, but wait a minute, we're not done here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, to those of you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed, apocalypsis, from heaven in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that do not know God. This will be in the day in which he comes, Elthi, which is a cognate of erkomai. Oh, wait a minute. Erkomai is used in Matthew chapter 24, 29 following, which Kenneth Gentry tells us is AD 70, but in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Elthi is the end of time. So Kenneth Gentry uses this missing word, different word hermeneutic to delineate between 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and chapter 1, and even delineate between Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, although he uses these words. Exactly right. I cover all of this extensively in this book. Okay, so anyway, I just had to make that point that here we have the divine inspired writer of Daniel using different words. He uses suntelia, he uses kairos, he uses pyros. Now let me flip the page over here to chapter 12. Let me see, verse 9. He said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed and sealed up to the time of the end. Until kairos, peros. See, the angel asked, what's the end of these things? Well, Daniel, close the book. It's sealed until the time of the end that the angel asked about. And then finally, verse 13, Daniel, you go your way and you rest, for there are yet days and seasons to the fulfillment of the end. I'm reading from the translation of the Septuagint. And thou shalt stand in the light at the end of the days. Okay, watch what he does. For days and seasons unto on a plerozon. Well, plerao is fulfillment. So here we have a cognate of plerao, and then he says, but it's on a plerozon suntelius. So once again, our friend suntelia is used, and then he says, you shall stand at your lot at the end of the days, which is unto suntelia hemeron. So here we got all these different words being used. And by the way, I love this text. You know, our friend Sam Frost says, well, the last day of John 6, 39, 44, 45, et cetera, et cetera. That's the last day of time. Well, wait a minute. Daniel was told that there were 1,335 days appointed. For what? Oh, that's to the resurrection, to the end of the age, to the suntelios, to the end of the days. I wonder if the end of the days includes the last day. I wonder if the 1,335th day, which would be the day of the resurrection, would be the last day, all of which would be fulfilled at the time when the power of the holy people completely shattered. Another example of the enemies of the truth of covenant eschatology really not thinking very well before they make an argument.
No, I loved how you showed the recapitulation between Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, and Daniel 12. Now, people, this is just conservative Christianity 101. But to show you the intense bias of Sam Frost, he knows the power of those chapters and how they're developed by Jesus and the New Testament writers. He knows it. He sees that train coming. And he has done all of his exegesis, all of his views on any given word, I mean, it's so biased to try and refute full preterism or run from it like Jonah did as far away as he can. He's adopted a liberal view of the book of Daniel, which practically doesn't see the Messianic kingdom or even Jesus, the Messiah,
barely
in these chapters. And so what you have is you have chapter 2, the stone cut without hands, the Messianic kingdom, the fifth kingdom. It's different than the other ones. It's a spiritual kingdom. Jesus says, my kingdom's not of this world. He says, when it comes, when I'm revealed from heaven, Luke 17, you're not going to be able to say, see here, see there. It's within you. Daniel 7, the kingdom comes again when Messiah comes as the Son of Man comes upon the clouds as the Ancient of Days, Old Greek Septuagint. Daniel chapter 9, we have all the atonement. We have, you've done a great job on the feast days, and I think you're going to pick that up on morning musings and get into the feast days. So that's awesome. And then Daniel 12 is a recapitulation of Daniel 9, which is built on 7, it's built on 2. And when he talks about that 3.5 years when the power of the holy people is completely shattered, that's the last half. The Messiah is cut off in that last 7. In the first 3.5, Jesus's earthly ministry was 3.5 years. He was cut off. He inaugurates the new covenant. But you have this remaining 3.5 years of the war, Daniel 9, 25 through 27. It's the war, the abomination, desolation, the tribulation. That's that last 3.5 years. Daniel 12 picks that right back up, and that's the end. Now, Jesus picks this up in Luke 21 when he's talking about the kairos, the appointed time. Some are going to say it's ended before, you should say it's going to be end. But he says, when he talks about the times of the Gentiles, treading Jerusalem underneath the feet of the Roman armies, and he connects that with the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. That's the abomination, desolation, or the abomination that will make desolate. Now you go to Romans 11, and he makes it clear that is that 3.5 years of Daniel 12. That's the appointed end. So this not yet of Christ coming in judgment of Psalm 110 is everywhere AD 70. So when we get to 1 Corinthians 15, folks, 1 Corinthians 15 is not an island unto itself. And that's the way these partial preterists approach it. And they don't want to make the parallels between First Corinthians 15 and the Olivet Discourse or Revelation or anywhere else. It's an island unto itself. And that, folks, is eisegesis, and that's no way to interpret the Bible.
Amen. Well, I tell you what, we're out of time, but I want to leave this little carrot. I discovered something this week from the Septuagint of Daniel 9.
Oh,
that I had never seen before. I can't do it now because I'm tied up with my microphone. I just literally slid across the floor in excitement. I'm going, whoa, 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 whoa. So needless to say, I'm writing an article on it.
is it connected to the feast days?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Well, technically it could be. No question about it, since the feast days saturate Daniel 9 so completely and thoroughly. But this is the carrot, folks. You got to be with us next week, and I'll reveal what this is. So don't let me forget that, Mike. I bet I won't forget it anyway.
I won't.
All right. Hey, folks, we're out of time. Thanks for joining us. Another great session. We enjoyed it. Good night, Mike.
Amen. Good night, brother.
All right. Yeah, I got to tell you, it's just, it blew my mind. It literally did. I threw it by my wife. Okay. I had to take her back to the doctor today, although this was good news. No issues found. It was a regular checkup. And so I'm riding along and I said, babe, I got to share something with you. I said, I found this week. I threw it by her and she's sitting there. She goes, okay, isn't that what you've been saying all along? I said, yes, but this is so clear. She goes,
okay, what verse of Daniel 9? You got to give me the verse at least.
Verse 27.
27. Okay, so that's
Get your Septuagint out. You look at it.
Yeah, which one?
Let me see. I have Brenton's. I have Brenton's Septuagint. So, okay, there you go. That's all I'm going to say.
All right.
Good night, man.
Take care.